At exactly 3:05 a.m., the ground beneath my neighborhood moved. Not a tremor, not a quake. The mountain. Above my home, the one the HOA had dug into without permits, without warning, broke. And within minutes, a wall of mud came crashing down through fences, homes, and lives. I tried to stop them. I sent reports. I showed them the risk. They fined me. They silenced me. But the earth, it didn't care about their politics. And when the sirens wailed and the National Guard flew in at dawn, it was already too late. When I first bought the house, it was the view that sold me. Tucked quietly at the base of a green ridge, on the edge of our suburban development, the property felt like a pocket of calm. From my back deck, I could see the treetops sway on the slope above, hear owls calling at dusk, and if I closed my eyes, I could almost forget I was just 20 minutes from the chaos of downtown. I was a single father. Then my daughter, Ellie, had just started high school, and I needed peace, stability, and space to heal. I was a combat engineer before I retired from the Army, and after everything I'd seen and done, I craved stillness more than anything else. At the time, the HOA barely registered as a concern. They seemed overly fond of newsletters and hedge trimming, but nothing that couldn't be tuned out. The dues were manageable, the bylaws fairly standard, and the neighbors kept to themselves. It wasn't paradise, but it was close enough. That is, until the new board took over. It started with something they called the Scenic Access Revitalization Plan, an overly grand name for what amounted to a trail and landscaping project. The idea apparently was to clear the brush and small trees from the slope behind several homes, including mine, and replace it with terraced walkways, benches, and native plant gardens. Improve community value, they said. Create shared nature access. I didn't recall anyone in the community begging for a walking trail on a 40-degree incline, but then again, the board didn't ask. They just announced it in a 2-sentence bulletin and marked it as approved. I didn't panic at first. Honestly, I assumed it would stall like most HOA projects. But then, one crisp Monday morning in late October, I was sipping coffee in the kitchen when I heard the distinct beeping of heavy machinery. I stepped outside and saw a massive yellow excavator climbing the ridge like some mechanical beast, its steel claw already tearing into the tree line above my backyard. At first, it didn't look like much. A few bushes ripped out, some topsoil shifted. I watched in disbelief as they hacked away at the brush that had blanketed the slope for decades. It wasn't just cosmetic. That brush was holding the hillside in place. Anyone who'd spent 5 minutes studying erosion knew that. I called the HOA's main office that afternoon. I asked for someone in charge of the project. They connected me with Karen Wexler, the board's new vice president and self-declared landscaping visionary. I still remember her tone, bright, patronizing, with that undercurrent of HOA authority that makes you want to tear your own ears off. "Oh, Mr. Alden, thank you for your concern," she said. "But we've consulted professionals. Everything's above board. And I think you'll be really pleased with the final result. That view is going to be stunning." I already had a stunning view, I said, trying to keep my voice level. Now I have a stripped slope above my house and a loose excavator operator cutting into root systems that are older than this entire subdivision. She laughed like I'd said something cute. "You're funny," she said. "But really, don't worry. The new slope plan meets state guidelines." "Did you run a geotechnical survey?" I asked. Silence. "I'll take that as a no." She hung up on me, just like that. That night, I stood at the edge of my backyard, staring up at the freshly exposed slope. It looked naked, vulnerable. I knew the soil here, the wrong kind of clay. No bedrock near the surface. During basic training, we'd been taught to look for telltale signs of terrain weakness, fissures, lean water, seepage. I'd seen all of them already. But now those signs were being ignored by people who thought aesthetics outweighed physics. Over the next week, they tore out 3 large oak stumps and leveled a shelf into the hillside. Every time I came home from work, I found new scars carved into the ridge. It was like watching someone dissect a body and call it beautification. I documented everything: photos, notes, timestamps. Old habits die hard. If it went wrong, I wanted proof. Ellie asked me once why I was so fixated. "Dad, it's just a trail," she said over dinner, poking at her pasta. "It's not just a trail," I said. "It's weight displacement. It's water flow. It's gravity." She smirked. "You sound like you're back in the field again." "I wish I weren't," I muttered. But I couldn't help it. Something felt wrong in my bones, the same way it had before our convoy was caught in a mudslide in eastern Afghanistan. We lost 2 vehicles. I still wake up hearing the metal crunch. I tried to get other neighbors involved, but most of them either didn't care or believed the HOA's reassurances. A few even praised Karen for her vision. I stood there in the board meeting a week later holding a binder full of documentation while Karen waved a color-printed landscape concept drawing and talked about community cohesion. They let me speak technically. 2 minutes on the agenda. I laid out the erosion concerns, the drainage risks, the slope angle calculations. I brought a copy of the county's own geological risk map. They nodded politely and moved to the next item: holiday decorations. After that, they started sending me letters. Warnings about non-compliant fence height. A notice about excessive visible clutter, which turned out to be a folded tarp on my porch. The message was clear: sit down, shut up, or they'd find a way to make me miserable. But I've been pushed before. Intimidation doesn't work on a man who's watched mountains move and lived to dig others out of the rubble. They had no idea what they were waking up. 3 days after they leveled the terrace into the hillside, I noticed the first fissure. It was small, narrow, and barely visible beneath the churned earth, but it was there. A jagged crack running horizontally across the newly cut slope just above where the last oak tree used to stand. To someone else, it might have looked like a natural line in the dirt. But to me, it was a message from the earth: pressure was building and the hillside wasn't happy. I took photos, close-ups, and wide shots, and compared them with the ones I'd taken a week earlier. It had grown by at least 2 inches. The soil was already shifting. That night, I compiled everything I had and submitted a formal incident report to the HOA board. I kept it professional, factual, annotated with engineering references, and time-stamped images. I sent it to their official email, copied Karen, and even printed 2 hard copies, one I dropped in the HOA mailbox, and one I kept for myself just in case someone claimed they never received it. The only response I got was silence. No acknowledgement, no follow-up, not even a canned thank you. 2 days later, I walked the trail after hours. The construction crew had left their equipment on site, so I climbed up the slope myself. The freshly cut surface was uneven and already showing signs of runoff. I spotted loose fill along the lower edge of the cut, where water had started carving shallow gullies into the terrace's face. They hadn't compacted the soil properly. No erosion matting, no drainage channels, just naked dirt. This wasn't just negligence, it was malpractice. Back at home, I called the contractor listed on the HOA's project notice. The man who picked up sounded like he was chewing something. When I introduced myself and mentioned the trail project, he turned curt. Sorry, sir. All communication goes through the HOA. I'm not at liberty to discuss specifics with homeowners. I tried anyway. Did you run a slope stability analysis before excavation? He paused. Like I said, you'll have to go through Karen. We follow what the client asks. You do realize someone could die if this slope gives way. Another pause, then he hung up. I stared at the phone for a long moment. Then I opened my laptop and began drafting a letter to the county's Department of Building and Safety. It wasn't the first time I'd had to go over someone's head to prevent a disaster. Back when I was stationed at Fort Bragg, we discovered a fault in a flood barrier that could have wiped out half a training base. The difference back then was that people listened. Here I was just a homeowner, one signature on a long HOA roster, trying to be heard above the din of petty politics. Still, I filed the complaint. I uploaded all my evidence, cited the specific municipal codes regarding slope development and runoff control, and flagged the entire area as high risk due to recent unpermitted grading. I even included a map overlay showing the proximity of my home and others directly downhill. I sent it and waited. The next morning, the HOA sent me a violation notice for a non-compliant mailbox color. It was beige. The day after that, someone from the board walked by my property and snapped photos. No greeting, no explanation. Just stood at the edge of my lawn and clicked like I was a crime scene. I called my neighbor Steve, one of the few people who still talked to me without flinching. He lived 2 doors down and worked as a surveyor. They're trying to pressure you out, he said, not even surprised. You stirred the pot. Doesn't it bother you that they're risking all our homes for some vanity trail? Steve sighed. It bothers me. But most folks here are scared of getting fined, man. They've got kids, mortgages, reputations. They don't want trouble. And Karen. She's on a mission. HOA gave her power, and now she thinks she's God. I hated how right he was. Still, someone from the city did finally respond. A junior inspector named Roger Gomez left me a voicemail asking for access to the property line and promising to take a look sometime next week. It wasn't much, but it was a foot in the door. When he arrived, I greeted him with my binder of documentation, a mug of black coffee, and a silent prayer. Roger was young, polite, but clearly in over his head. He walked, the property looked up at the slope, nodded gravely, and said, "Yeah, that looks not great." I pointed out the cracks the water gouges and the loose fill. He took notes on a little pad, but avoided any definitive statements. "Well, I'll have to check with my supervisor," he said. "See if this falls under our jurisdiction, or if it's considered private land development. It's directly above occupied homes," I said. "If that hillside collapses, it'll bury 3 backyards and possibly kill someone." "I hear you," Roger said. "I'll escalate it." But nothing came of it. A week passed, then another. Meanwhile, the slope got worse. Rains came early that year, short bursts of thunderstorm that left rivulets streaking down the cut and pooled water at the base. The dirt began to sag, subtle but visible. I noticed a new crack forming near the old one. I took more photos, filed a second report. Still no response. Karen, on the other hand, was thriving. She posted photos of the revitalization project on the community board, angled just right to avoid showing the erosion. She called it an inspiring model for other HOAs across the state. People commented with emojis and praise. I felt like I was going insane. Every day, I looked up at that slope like it was a loaded gun pointed at my house. And I was the only one who heard the safety click off. I knew I was running out of time. All it would take was one long rain, a proper storm, and gravity would take over. It wasn't an if, it was a when, so I doubled down. I emailed the local news. I contacted the county supervisor directly. I started a file on a secure drive and made sure Ellie knew how to access it in case something happened. I even called an old Army buddy who now worked with FEMA just to ask hypothetically what would happen if a private HOA project triggered a landslide. His answer chilled me. Best case, it's property damage and lawsuits. Worst case, it's body bags. And still the HOA stayed silent. Like they were waiting for the hill to speak louder than I could. If there's one thing I've learned about HOA power structures, it's this. The louder the voice, the less accountability it usually carries. And no one in our subdivision spoke louder or smiled wider than Karen Wexler. Karen had only been on the HOA board for a year and a half, but in that time she had turned what was once a passive and tolerable bureaucracy into a full-blown kingdom. She loved the spotlight, and the new slope project gave her the perfect stage. She created her own subcommittee, called it the Slope Enhancement and Community Wellness Task Force, and positioned herself as its chair, of course. No elections, no oversight. Just Karen and a few hand-picked friends from the tennis club and the garden club people more concerned with wildflower arrangements than soil compression ratios. She strutted around in monogrammed fleece jackets with the HOA logo embroidered across the chest like she was commanding a battalion. On weekends, she gave walking tours of the incomplete trail to residents, speaking in that syrupy voice that masked her condescension with faux civility. I tried attending one of those tours quietly in the back, but I didn't last 5 minutes before she called me out. "Oh, look everyone, Mr. Alden's here. You know he's been very passionate about this project. Lots of feelings." Everyone laughed. Not cruelly, but in that polite HOA way where people chuckle to keep the peace. I didn't say a word, just turned around and left. She was crafting a narrative, and I was being cast as the cranky veteran with conspiracy theories and a chip on my shoulder. I didn't fit the smiling Stepford mold. I didn't attend the social mixers. I didn't vote for her. So now I was the enemy. That week, I received 3 violation notices in the mail. One for excessive mildew on exterior siding. A patch smaller than a dollar bill near the garage vent. One for non-native plants in yard border, some wild ferns Ellie had planted from her science project, and one for unauthorized alterations to property frontage. That last one was about a small wooden bench I'd placed under the oak tree in front of our house, a bench that had been there since we moved in. It was petty, it was transparent, and it was strategic. I started documenting everything again. I took photos of the bench, the siding, the yard, and compared them to other houses on our street with worse offenses that hadn't been cited. I began logging the violations dates and timestamps of when HOA members walked by. I wasn't just preparing for a landslide anymore. I was preparing for war. Then one afternoon, Karen showed up on my porch. I'll never forget the way she stood there, arms crossed over her clipboard, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the metal. She didn't ask to come in. Didn't offer a greeting. I thought we could have a neighborly chat, she said, smiling with teeth but not eyes. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. I don't think we have much to talk about. Oh, I think we do, she said, scanning my face, like she was looking for weak points. I've been getting some concerned emails. Residents are worried. They say you're spreading fear, making unfounded accusations, contacting outside agencies. That's not very community-minded, is it? I didn't answer. You've served in the military, haven't you? She asked, switching tactics. I have. So you understand the importance of hierarchy, of chain of command. You understand that sometimes for the greater good, we have to follow plans, even if we don't like them. I laughed. You think this is the same as following orders on a battlefield? She didn't blink. I think we all have a role to play. And when someone steps outside their role, things unravel. That was it. The threat under the smile. I've warned your team about the slope, I said, calm but firm. I've warned you about the runoff. If you keep digging into that hill without proper retention, someone's going to get hurt. Karen's smile vanished. If you keep interfering, Mr. Alden, I'll recommend the board pursue legal action for harassment. And I promise you the fines won't stop at mailboxes and mildew. She turned and walked off my porch like she'd just won something. I stood there, fists clenched, as her footsteps crunched down the gravel path and her SUV pulled away. That night, I sat Ellie down and told her everything. She listened quietly, chewing her thumbnail, as she always did when she was nervous. Is our house in danger? She asked. I'm doing everything I can to keep us safe, I said. But the HOA, they can't just ignore this, right? They can, I said, and they are. She nodded and didn't say anything more. But I could tell the fear had settled in her chest, just like it had in mine. She stopped opening her window at night after that. She used to love listening to the frogs and wind in the trees. Now the hill had become a shadow she avoided. That weekend, I drove out to a hardware supply store 2 towns over and bought my own rain gauge water sensors and a vibration monitor I could set into the ground behind my property. I knew I couldn't stop the rain, but maybe I could buy us seconds, maybe minutes, if I saw the slope start to give. I also backed up every report photo email and time-stamped video onto 2 separate hard drives. One I kept at home. The other I mailed to a cousin out of state with instructions not to open it unless I told him to. I wasn't just preparing for a landslide anymore. I was preparing for a cover-up. Because when that hill came down, and it would, Karen would lie. The board would lie. And they would bury the truth right along with whatever was left of my house. It happened at 3:47 a.m. Not the landslide yet. That came later. What happened at 3:47 was subtler, quieter, but far more terrifying. I woke to a sound I hadn't heard since Kandahar, a deep, low growling shift, like the earth exhaling under strain. It was the sound of pressure releasing somewhere underground, a sound I'd only heard once before, right before an entire ridge collapsed on the convoy behind us. I bolted upright in bed, my instincts already ahead of my thoughts. Ellie stirred in the next room but didn't wake. I walked barefoot to the back window, heart pounding in my throat. The moon was low, painting the slope in silver and shadow. And then I saw it. The terrace they'd cut weeks ago now held a dark, jagged trench through its center. A crack, wider than before, deeper, like a lightning bolt had been etched into the soil by an invisible hand. The vibration sensor I'd placed at the base of the slope was blinking red. I slipped on boots and a jacket and stepped outside. The air was damp and cold, charged with the tension that usually came before a storm or something worse. The ground beneath my feet felt spongy, unstable. I approached the sensor's display and confirmed its significant subterranean shift. Not a tremor, no seismic event had been recorded nearby, but the hillside was moving. I documented everything: photos of the crack, a short video of water seeping along the edges, time-stamped logs from the sensor. I emailed it all to the HOA, the county engineer's office, and even local news desks. I didn't care anymore who thought I was a nuisance. This was real. By sunrise, Karen had replied not to address the report, but to issue another warning. Mr. Alden spreading unverified panic is a serious violation of community standards. You are to cease all independent surveying and communications that misrepresent HOA projects. Your behavior has been noted. Noted, like I was a child writing graffiti on the bathroom walls. I showed the email to Ellie over breakfast. She didn't laugh this time. She just looked down at her cereal like it might swallow her back. I started checking the slope every morning after that, like a ritual. I noticed new signs, daily soil displacement, water sheeting in new directions, footprints from the workers crisscrossing the fragile surface. They were still bringing in equipment, still carving deeper into the terrain despite every warning. They hadn't even installed proper retaining measures. No drainage pipe, no gabion baskets, just some temporary mesh netting and a few stakes to stabilize an entire hillside. I couldn't stop the memories anymore. They came back with every shift of the soil, every sound in the night. Back in Afghanistan, we had a rule: never dig into a hill without reading the land. Our enemy was the terrain itself, the rocks, the weight of water. We lost people when we ignored that. I still saw Corporal Davis in my dreams, 22, quick to joke, buried under 5 tons of wet clay after a night of rain near Jalalabad. We dug for 3 hours. I found his helmet, not him. That memory returned one night as I stood at the edge of my property, watching the clouds roll in again. Rain was coming. A heavy system. I could feel it. So I did what I knew how to do. I built my own barrier. Ellie helped. We hauled sandbags from the garage and placed them in rows along the back edge of our yard. I used stakes and plastic sheeting to divert water. It wasn't enough to stop a landslide, but maybe it could buy us time, or at least deflect the worst of it. I messaged Steve, my surveyor neighbor, and asked if he'd help me lay a temporary grade map to chart water flow. He hesitated at first, said his wife didn't want him getting involved, but eventually he showed up with his tools. We marked the angles, confirmed the slope was failing. 2 inches of rain in under an hour, he said. That's all it would take. And the forecast showed 3 inches. I made copies of the grade maps and emailed them too. I even drove to the HOA's community center and slid one under the door with a post-it. And this is not a warning, it's a promise. You ignored the land. Now it's going to answer. The next day, Ellie didn't go to school. Not because of the slope, because of the stairs. Someone's parent had posted online that I was endangering neighborhood cohesion. Rumors spread fast in places like this. HOA fearmongers, they called us. Conspiracy theorists, doomsday preppers. I kept my mouth shut, let them laugh. But I packed 2 emergency bags, stashed them by the front door. I showed Ellie how to unlock the back fence in case we had to run. I cleared a path between the house and the street away from the slope. I kept the truck gassed and facing outward. I also called my old commanding officer now with the state's emergency management agency. I asked plainly what it would take to escalate a private development threat to a statewide response. His answer, proof of imminent risk and a credible request from a citizen with verified experience. I told him I had both. He said if the slope moves, call me first. That night I didn't sleep. The rain started just before midnight. Slow at first, just a patter against the roof like fingers tapping a warning. I stood at the window watching water pool at the base of the hill. Then it intensified. Wind howled, lightning snapped across the sky, and the slope began to shine with runoff water glinting in every crack and channel. At 2:19 a.m., the sensor triggered again, this time a long, unbroken red pulse. The earth was moving. Again. I rushed outside with a flashlight and aimed it up the slope. And for the first time, I saw it sag. Not a trick of the light, not a shadow. The soil above the terrace bulged, and then a long, low groan. The mountain was holding its breath, and I knew it wouldn't be holding it for much longer. At 2:34 a.m., I made the first of 3 calls that night. The first was to my old CO Colonel Brett Marlowe, who now worked with the state's emergency management agency. When he picked up, I skipped the pleasantries. It's happening, I said. You're sure? There's movement. Ground sensors confirm. The slope is bulging. If this rain holds another 30 minutes, it's coming down. He was silent for half a second. Send me your most recent files. I'll initiate the alert chain. Keep your phone on. The second call was to 911. I described the situation, emphasized the size of the slope, the proximity to residential homes, the absence of retaining structures. The operator's tone shifted the moment I said slope failure in progress. Dispatch sent units immediately. The third call was to the HOA emergency line, not because I thought it would help, but because I needed a record. I left a message calm and clinical outlining the visible signs of imminent collapse, the rainfall rate, the history of ignored warnings. I ended with one line: evacuate the lower properties. You have 15 minutes. Then I turned off the porch light and woke Ellie. She didn't ask questions. She'd been sleeping with her shoes near the bed for a week. We loaded our go bags and went outside in the rain, standing near the truck, under the whine of wind and water. My phone buzzed. Text from Brett. National Guard on standby. County response incoming. You did the right thing. At 3:05 a.m., the power flickered. The ground gave a soft tremble, subtle but unmistakable. And then came the noise. Not like thunder. Not like anything you hear in a city. It was a roar, a deep, bottomless sound like the earth tearing in half. I turned eyes wide. The hill was moving. A river of mud, trees, rock, and debris broke free from the top terrace and came rushing down. It wasn't fast like in the movies. It moved with a sickening, unstoppable force, dragging everything in its path like a slow-motion tsunami of earth. The sound was deafening. I grabbed Ellie's arm and pulled her into the truck. We barely had time to drive 20 feet down the street before the mudslide swallowed our backyard. I watched in the rearview mirror as the garden shed vanished in a wave of soil. Fence posts snapped like twigs. A neighbor's above-ground pool was ripped from its base and launched like a raft down the street. And still the HOA hadn't issued a single alert. But the city had heard me. By 3:30, fire engines had begun to arrive. Flashing lights painted the wet streets in streaks of red and blue. Sirens howled in every direction. Neighbors stumbled out of their homes in pajamas, and panic-confused, disoriented, soaked to the bone. By 4:00, the first unit of the National Guard landed in the empty lot near the community center, brought in by helicopter because the main road was already blocked by debris. Ellie and I sat in the truck watching it all unfold. Our home was gone. At least the back half was. The entire rear wall had been caved in by a wall of mud and broken timber. The kitchen window now opened into sludge. The deck, my quiet place, my lookout, was just gone. Washed down into the cul-de-sac below like a forgotten toy. And Karen, nowhere in sight. It wasn't until daylight broke that I saw her again. She was standing across the street in her slippers robe, soaked through, staring at the slope with an expression I didn't recognize. Not panic, not guilt, just disbelief. Like she'd watched a magician pull a trick she never agreed to. She looked across the road at me. Our eyes locked. I didn't wave. I didn't nod. She looked away first. By 8:00 a.m., the mayor's office declared a local state of emergency. The slide had damaged or destroyed 9 homes. At least 4 were considered total losses. Miraculously, no one was killed. 2 people were hospitalized with injuries from falling debris, one of them an elderly man who had to be airlifted out by rescue crew. He lived directly downhill from the trail's lowest tier. The news vans arrived by noon. I gave them everything. The photos, the documentation, the sensor logs, the emails. I printed copies of the warning letters I'd sent the HOA. I handed out maps and diagrams and explained in plain English exactly how this disaster had been avoidable. Every report ended the same way. Resident warned HOA. Warnings ignored. Slope collapsed. By evening, my phone was ringing nonstop. Reporters, lawyers, engineers. Officials from the state's emergency department. But not a word from Karen. Not a word from the HOA. Instead, the HOA issued a generic statement to the press. Our hearts go out to the families affected by this unfortunate natural event. The HOA board is working closely with first responders to ensure the safety and recovery of our community. We will withhold further comment until a formal investigation is complete. Natural event. I wanted to scream. The next morning, I drove to City Hall armed with a copy of every document I had. I didn't have an appointment, but when I asked for the Chief of Code Enforcement and dropped Colonel Marlowe's name, they let me in. The meeting was brief, but intense. I laid out my case. The ignored warnings, the lack of permits for major grading, the falsified reports that said the slope was stable. I even had screenshots of HOA emails claiming the slope met all geological standards without ever having hired a geotechnical engineer. They took notes, real notes. An hour later, I was introduced to a woman from the district attorney's office. She shook my hand like it mattered. "Mr. Alden," she said, "I think we're going to need you to testify." I nodded. "I was hoping you'd say that." By the end of the week, a full investigation had been opened. The contractor who dug the slope without permits was subpoenaed. Karen was photographed entering City Hall with her attorney, wearing sunglasses like a celebrity caught in scandal. The community, once content with HOA-sponsored movie nights and garden awards, had become a war zone of opinions. Some still clung to the narrative of unfortunate accident, but most were beginning to understand this wasn't nature's wrath. It was negligence. And that's when I realized something had shifted not just in the earth, but in the community itself. People who'd avoided me before started stopping by. One left a pie. Another brought bottled water and asked if Ellie was okay. Steve returned the grade maps I'd given him, looking ashamed. "I should have said more," he muttered. "It's not too late," I said. "There's still truth to dig out." Because now the slope wasn't the only thing under pressure. The entire foundation of the HOA's authority was beginning to crack. And unlike that hillside, I wasn't going to let them patch it over. The official report labeled it an atmospheric river event. 8 inches of rain in less than 24 hours funneled by a slow-moving storm system and intensified by already saturated soil. But by the time those words appeared in news broadcasts and PDF briefings, the damage had already been done. The storm that hit us wasn't just rain, it was reckoning. The city's infrastructure buckled fast. Street drains overflowed low-lying intersections, became lakes, and the main exit road from our subdivision turned into a slow-moving river of runoff and debris. I watched it from my truck parked uphill on the only patch of asphalt that hadn't cracked. It looked like something out of a disaster film. Telephone poles, half submerged, a trampoline tangled in downed power lines, trash bins floating like buoys, and beneath it all, the mud. Thick, relentless, alive. Our house, or what remained of it, was now behind a yellow tape line and considered structurally unsound. Emergency crews had flagged it for future demolition if the land didn't stabilize. I had already salvaged what I could: birth certificates, service medals, Ellie's baby photos in a watertight case. Everything else was either gone or buried. But this part of the story isn't about what I lost. It's about what they tried to bury next. While the National Guard continued stabilizing the remaining slope and evacuating vulnerable homes, the HOA made its move. They issued a blanket communication through the neighborhood's online portal, an emergency statement that was anything but helpful. It claimed the landslide had been exacerbated by unapproved private alterations to storm barriers and hinted that unauthorized homeowner modifications had contributed to water mismanagement. They were blaming me. They didn't say my name, but they didn't have to. Everyone knew I had placed my own sandbags. Everyone knew I'd built that temporary runoff channel at the edge of my property. And everyone knew I'd gone public with my warnings before the disaster. Karen's fingerprints were all over the statement. It was a last-ditch attempt to rewrite the narrative, to shift focus away from the months of negligence, the ignored reports, and the illegal excavation toward the guy who had tried to stop it. But this time, I wasn't the only one speaking up. Ellie came to me with her phone that afternoon. "Dad, look." The neighborhood message board was exploding. Residents were posting drone footage, time-stamped video from doorbell cameras, even text screenshots from Karen herself where she dismissed slope concerns and told someone to enjoy the upgraded view while it lasts. There were calls for emergency HOA meetings, demands for her resignation, even a petition to dissolve the current board entirely. People were waking up. I forwarded all of it to the city investigators. Then I went further. I sat down and wrote a full statement for the district attorney's office. 4 pages, clear, direct. I outlined the entire timeline from the first day I saw that excavator to the exact minute I made the call to the National Guard. I listed every complaint I filed, every message sent, every violation notice received after raising my concerns. I included copies of the original HOA trail proposal, poorly formatted without technical documentation or proper permitting. I annotated it all like an after-action report, and then I delivered it in person. The assistant DA took it from me with both hands. "You understand this could become a criminal case," she said quietly. "Negligence, fraud, false reporting, maybe even reckless endangerment." I nodded. "It already is. You just need to say it out loud." That night, I got a call from Brett. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "Try me." The HOA filed an incident report with the Office of Emergency Services, claiming their development project was sabotaged by a disgruntled homeowner. I closed my eyes. Unbelievable. But they screwed up. They listed the wrong timestamp for the slope failure. It doesn't match the city's seismic data. And the guard's deployment log proves their story's false. We've got them on timeline discrepancies, failure to disclose grading activity, and at least 3 counts of non-permitted alteration to stormwater systems. I let that sink in. They're unraveling, I said. No, he replied. They're exposed. 2 days later, the city hosted an open forum at the Civic Center. It was meant to address disaster recovery insurance assistance and temporary housing. But it turned into something else entirely. Over 100 residents showed up. Half had mud on their boots. The other half had anger in their eyes. One by one, they stood up and told their stories. A father of 3 who lost the entire back half of his home. An elderly couple whose medical oxygen machines had shorted out in the flood. A teenager who barely escaped when the slope behind her bedroom caved in. Then someone stood up and said, I warned them. I tried. And for the first time, it wasn't just me. It was Steve. He held up one of the grade maps we had drawn together, soaked, smudged, but still legible. I was a surveyor for 30 years, he said, and I kept quiet because I didn't want to get fined. But now I'd rather lose a mailbox than my soul. The room erupted, and when Karen finally appeared flanked by 2 board members and a red-faced attorney, the crowd turned. No jeers, no insults, just a wall of cold, quiet contempt. She tried to speak, but the microphone didn't work. It didn't matter. No one was listening anymore. By the time the forum ended, 2 more board members had resigned. Karen stormed out under a flurry of camera flashes and local news microphones. The mayor's office announced that an independent audit of all HOA operations in our district would begin immediately. And I drove back to what was left of our home. Ellie sat beside me, quiet but lighter somehow, like she could finally breathe again. We parked across the street and stared at the wreckage. The slope was bare now, just broken roots, exposed clay, and the brutal honesty of gravity. But behind it, the sky was finally clearing. The storm had arrived. It had destroyed so much. But it had also revealed everything. And from that kind of clarity, justice isn't just possible, it's inevitable. The day after the community forum, I woke to the sound of military helicopters thumping overhead again. But this time, it wasn't panic. It was coordination. A full-scale emergency response had now replaced the piecemeal chaos of the early hours. National Guard units moved methodically through the neighborhood, setting up barriers, surveying damaged areas, and beginning the slow, brutal task of excavation. At least 4 homes had been condemned. Dozens more were yellow-tagged for structural instability. Utilities had been shut off to entire blocks, including ours, and FEMA trailers had begun arriving for displaced families. I stood outside the borrowed motel room where Ellie and I had been staying, sipping lukewarm coffee from a styrofoam cup, watching footage on the local news. A helicopter had caught the moment the slope fully gave way, captured it with terrifying clarity. The hillside didn't crumble all at once. It folded like a tired body collapsing from its own weight, and then poured itself downhill in a way that defied belief. That clip played on every major channel within hours. I didn't recognize my neighborhood in the aerial shots. The street where we used to walk our dog gone. The park bench where I used to sit with Ellie and read her stories, buried in mud. But the worst part wasn't the damage. It was the fact that no one was surprised anymore. Because by now everyone knew the truth, this wasn't a freak act of nature. It was the cost of arrogance. Later that afternoon, I received a call from a representative of the State Emergency Board. Her voice was clipped precise, like someone used to briefing senators. Mr. Alden, we've completed our preliminary analysis. Your documentation was invaluable. It corroborated our independent findings and exposed multiple violations. What does that mean exactly? I asked. It means the HOA board is now under formal investigation for negligent development without proper permitting, failure to comply with city grading ordinances, and misrepresentation to both residents and state officials. Criminal charges. That's for the district attorney to decide. But we're not ruling anything out. I hung up stunned, but not surprised. I had always known where this was going. What I hadn't expected, though, was the human fallout. I started hearing from neighbors, people I hadn't spoken to in months. Some apologized. Others offered to help. One man, James, who had once publicly defended Karen at a board meeting, dropped off a handwritten letter. It was soaked in rain, scrawled and messy, but sincere. I should have listened. We all should have. You tried to save us, and we laughed. I'm so sorry. I didn't need apologies, but it still meant something. Later that evening, Brett texted me again. Be ready. You'll be contacted for testimony soon. They're moving forward. 2 days later, I was sitting in a wood-paneled room under harsh fluorescent lights, walking 2 assistant district attorneys through the entire sequence of events. I brought physical folders. They brought digital binders. Every photo I'd taken, every email I'd sent, every petty violation I'd received after I spoke out. Did you ever receive written notice from the HOA that they conducted a soil survey prior to excavation? One of the attorneys asked. No. Did they ever submit proof of permit from the city for land modification? No. Did they ever formally respond to your warnings aside from violation notices? No. Only Karen Wexler called me once, and that was to imply I should stay quiet. The younger ADA looked up. Imply, she said I was jeopardizing community harmony, and that legal action would follow if I continued spreading fear. The older attorney leaned forward. We have similar complaints from other residents now. You were the first, but not the only. And that's when it clicked. They weren't just building a case. They were building a pattern. I left the courthouse that day exhausted and oddly empty. For months, I had poured every ounce of energy into stopping what I knew was coming. Then it happened. The mountain fell. The truth surfaced. The board was collapsing. And now I was just waiting for the system to deliver something that resembled justice. Back in the motel, Ellie was curled up on the bed watching videos on her phone. Not laughing, not crying, just numb. I sat beside her and took her hand. Do you want to go for a drive? I asked. She looked at me, expression unreadable. Where? Back home, I said. She didn't say anything, just nodded. We drove slowly, passing neighborhoods still caked in mud. Yellow tape fluttered in the wind. Sump pumps roared from open garage doors. The air still smelled like wet earth and exposed roots. When we reached our block, we parked at the top of the hill. The slope, what was left of it, had been reshaped by disaster crews. No longer steep, just a raw gash in the earth cordoned off with mesh and scaffolding waiting for reinforcement. And our house, the structure still stood, though barely. The rear was open to the elements. Our living room floor ended in jagged splinters where the mud had broken through. Ellie's bedroom had survived somehow. Her bookshelf was still upright, her favorite sweater still hanging on a hook. We stood in silence watching it all. Then Ellie whispered, "Why didn't they listen to you?" I didn't have an answer. Because the truth was too bitter to speak aloud. People in power rarely listen until the cost of silence becomes too steep. We didn't stay long, just long enough to say goodbye. On the way back to the car, a news crew intercepted us. Mr. Alden, would you be willing to speak about the investigation? I stopped, looked at Ellie. She nodded. I turned back to the camera. They called it a natural disaster, I said, voice calm. But the disaster wasn't natural. It was man-made. It started with a shovel in the wrong place and a refusal to listen. The cameraman gave a thumbs up. The reporter looked stunned. Ellie took my hand as we walked away. No one said another word. But in that silence, I felt something else finally breaking loose. Not the ground beneath us, but the hold they'd had over this place. The chaos had revealed something they never intended anyone to see. The truth. And it was finally coming out. I never wanted to become a symbol. All I ever wanted was to protect my home, keep my daughter safe, and maybe sit in peace on my back deck without worrying if the hill above me would come crashing down. But by the time the smoke cleared and the cameras left, I was no longer just a homeowner. I was the man who warned them. The man who wouldn't shut up. The man who had receipts. 2 weeks after the landslide, I was called back to City Hall for a formal deposition. This time, there were lawyers, 3 from the city, 2 from the state, and 1 representing a group of displaced homeowners already organizing for a class action lawsuit. The energy in the room was different now. No longer cautious or bureaucratic. It was focused, strategic. I sat for over 6 hours, walking them through everything. Every email, every meeting, every phone call. I showed them the sensor logs, the erosion maps, the complaint letters, the HOA violation notices that began the minute I spoke out, the text messages from neighbors who had tried to warn Karen in private and were ignored. One message in particular made the room go quiet. It was from a board member months earlier who had texted Karen after a meeting. "Should we get a proper engineering report before we dig?" Her reply, "No time. We'll deal with pushback later. Once it's built, no one can undo it." I watched the city attorney's jaw tighten. "This is negligence," he said. "Documented, deliberate negligence." "No," I said quietly. "This is sabotage dressed up as progress." They thanked me, and I left the building with a strange weight in my chest. Not anxiety. Not even relief. Something more like resolve. The next day, subpoenas were issued. Karen was the first to be served. She tried to deny it at first, told reporters she was being persecuted by angry residents and one particularly unstable ex-military homeowner. But it was too late. The paper trail was too clear, too public. The same local station that once played smiling interviews of her touting the Scenic Ridge beautification plan was now showing her slamming her door in the face of a process server. I heard whispers from around the neighborhood. Karen had resigned from the board, but not before trying to erase HOA meeting recordings. Unfortunately for her, the city had already backed up the digital files from the public portal, and the recordings were damning. On one clip, dated 2 weeks before the landslide, Karen could be heard saying, "We don't need to run every project past the city. If we follow every code to the letter, we'll never get anything done." She was done now. So were 2 other board members, one who had signed off on the excavation permits without review, and another who had rubber-stamped the budget increase for slope landscaping despite multiple resident objections. Meanwhile, the class action lawsuit gained momentum. Steve became one of the co-plaintiffs. So did the elderly couple, whose oxygen machines failed. So did James, the neighbor, who once defended Karen, but whose entire ground floor had been overtaken by mud and debris. And me. They asked me to be the lead. I didn't say yes right away. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew what it meant. It meant reliving every moment of what we'd just survived. It meant standing in front of strangers in a courtroom and explaining why warnings matter and what happens when they're dismissed. I talked to Ellie first. She sat on the edge of her cot in the temporary shelter, staring down at a plastic cup of orange juice. "I want to go home," she whispered. I knelt beside her. "I know, sweetheart. I do too." She looked at me. "Will we ever live there again?" I wanted to lie. I wanted to say yes, but the truth was more complicated. "I don't know," I said. "But if we don't fight, someone else is going to go through the same thing." She nodded. "Then fight." So I said yes. Within days, my name was on the legal filing. The lawsuit named the HOA as an entity, as well as Karen Wexler, the project contractor, and the individual board members who had voted to approve excavation without proper permits. The city, too, was named in a separate complaint for failing to enforce oversight, despite multiple warnings. What surprised me the most was how many neighbors supported us. They brought meals, donated clothes, offered guest rooms. One man, someone I hadn't spoken to in months, handed me an envelope of cash and said, "For Ellie. School clothes. It's the least we can do." Karen, meanwhile, had gone quiet. Her house had survived the landslide. Barely. But she wasn't seen walking the neighborhood anymore. Her garden club friends stopped answering calls. Rumors swirled about her fleeing to stay with family out of state. And then the biggest shift of all, an emergency HOA election. The residents demanded it. For the first time since I'd lived in the neighborhood, people actually campaigned. Not just for control of the board, but for a new kind of leadership. Steve was elected president by a landslide. Another neighbor, a former FEMA consultant, took over compliance and safety. And for the first time in HOA history, they created a standing advisory panel made up of ordinary residents, one that required oversight on every development project going forward. They offered me a seat on the panel. I declined. I'd fought enough for 1 year, but I did show up to the first meeting. And when I saw the new sign on the wall, "Community First Always," I felt something shift inside me. Not closure. Not yet. But the beginning of something better. That night, back at the shelter, Ellie asked, "Are you still angry?" I thought about it. About the mud, the letters, the smug smile on Karen's face when she dismissed my warnings. "Not angry," I said. "Then what?" "Ready," I told her. "I'm ready to rebuild, the right way." The courthouse smelled like old paper and cheap coffee. That's what I remember most about the first day of the trial. By then, the lawsuit had expanded to include 15 families, 3 HOA board members, and the contractor responsible for excavating the slope. The case had drawn regional attention. Local reporters lined the courthouse steps, and every morning as we entered, there were cameras waiting their lenses, cold and relentless. But I wasn't there for spectacle. I was there for the truth. Karen showed up late the first day, flanked by a high-priced attorney and wearing sunglasses indoors like the shame might not find her if her eyes stayed hidden. She didn't look at me. Not then. Not once during jury selection. Not during opening statements. But I watched her. Her posture. Her silence. The way she flinched when our lead attorney described the death of a neighborhood dog buried in a backyard that used to be a child's playground. That silence was the only honest thing about her. The state's case was simple but devastating. The HOA board had approved a landscaping project without proper engineering review, had ignored multiple warnings from a qualified former military engineer, me, and had failed to obtain the necessary permits for slope modification. When confronted, they not only failed to act, they retaliated with fines, threats, and cover-ups. We had documents. We had photos. We had board meeting recordings, one of which included Karen saying, "Once we start the project, it's a done deal. He can't stop us." But the most damning evidence came from inside. It was a woman named Janice Rhodes, an HOA treasurer who had quietly resigned 2 weeks after the landslide. I hadn't spoken to her since this all began, but there she was, walking into court on the third day, holding a thumb drive, and looking like she hadn't slept in weeks. When she took the stand, the courtroom hushed. "I kept backups," she said. "I knew Karen was hiding things. I didn't know it would get this far, but I knew she was lying." On that drive were emails, dozens of them, including one where Karen pressured Janice to reclassify the slope enhancement budget as trail maintenance to avoid permit questions. Another where she admitted skipping a soil review because those reports cost too much and slow everything down. It was nuclear. Karen's attorney objected, scrambled, accused Janice of forging evidence. But the chain of custody was solid. And when the judge overruled the objection and allowed the evidence, I finally saw it. Karen's face cracked. Her expression collapsed in on itself, not in panic, but in realization. Like the weight of every lie had finally settled onto her shoulders all at once. She slouched in her chair, eyes no longer searching for allies in the courtroom. Because there were none left, the civil case proceeded faster than anyone expected. With Janice's testimony, the documents, the video, and our collective damage reports, physical, emotional, financial, the jury deliberated less than 3 hours. Verdict: liable on all counts, gross negligence, willful misconduct, retaliation. The HOA was ordered to pay full damages to every plaintiff. The contractor, too. Karen Wexler and 2 board members were referred to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges related to falsified records and unlawful permitting. The judgment made headlines, but more importantly, it made change. The city announced new oversight protocols for all HOA development projects within county limits. An emergency fund was created for slope stability infrastructure in high-risk residential areas. And at our own neighborhood level, something even more remarkable happened. The residents called for a full HOA charter revision. They rewrote the rules from the ground up: more transparency, tighter checks on board power, mandatory public forums before any large-scale project. Every major decision now required a 2/3 vote from homeowners, and all HOA meetings live-streamed and archived. Steve, the new board president, asked me to consult on rebuilding efforts. I agreed. Not because I wanted power, but because I wanted to make sure no one else ever got steamrolled the way we had. Together, we hired a geotechnical team, reinforced the entire hillside with proper drainage systems, retaining walls, and erosion controls. They even built a small memorial garden on the edge of what used to be my backyard. A bench, a plaque, a grove of native plants that wouldn't destabilize the soil. The plaque read, "This ground gave way so others could stand stronger. Let us never ignore a warning again." I didn't ask for it. But when Ellie and I visited it for the first time, she touched the edge of the plaque, smiled faintly, and said, "They finally listened." Karen, meanwhile, disappeared from public life. Her home was sold. Her garden club disbanded. Rumors swirled that she'd moved back east to live with a sister, but no one really knew. She never apologized, never wrote, never showed her face again. And maybe that was its own kind of justice. But it wasn't revenge I was after. It was reckoning. One afternoon, months later, I received a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside a folded sheet of paper in neat handwriting. You were right. I was wrong. I will live with it every day. I hope you and your daughter find peace. There was no signature, but I recognized the handwriting. It wasn't closure, but it was close, and sometimes that's enough. Spring came early that year. The rain gave way to a long stretch of sunlight, the kind that makes everything seem clean again, even if it isn't. Even if there's still mud in the gutters and cracks in the pavement. Even if some things can never go back to the way they were. Ellie and I stood on the rebuilt edge of our lot, the lot that once held the house. We tried so hard to protect. It had taken 6 months, but the land had finally been cleared, surveyed, reinforced, and leveled. In place of the fragile slope that had loomed above us for years, there now stood a proper retaining wall, concrete, steel-reinforced, professionally engineered, and permitted to the letter. It rose like a spine out of the earth, clean, strong, and utterly unmovable. I ran my hand along its surface, still cool from the morning dew, still new enough to smell of cement and rebirth. It wasn't just a wall. It was a line in the ground, drawn not by fear, but by resolve. The message was unspoken but clear. This far, no further. Behind me, Ellie was walking slowly along the edge of what would soon be the new foundation. She was taller now, older, or maybe just wiser. There's something about surviving the ground falling out from under you that forces a kind of growth no textbook can teach. I still remember the sound she said, suddenly not looking at me. I turned to her. The mud, she continued, how it moved, like it was alive. I nodded. I still hear it sometimes, in my sleep. She looked up at the wall. This feels different. It is, I said. Because this time, we built it right, and we built it together. That was true. The new house hadn't just been my project. The community had rallied. Volunteers helped clear debris. Neighbors brought meals. One local construction firm even donated labor to help pour the new foundation. The old HOA charter gone. Rewritten from scratch. The board now included engineers, educators, 2 renters, and a retired city inspector. Karen's name had become something like folklore, whispered, cautionary, and distant. Her face never returned to our street, and no one missed it. I was offered a permanent seat on the board after the elections. I turned it down. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally felt like I didn't have to fight anymore. I'd carried the weight for long enough. It was time to put it down. Instead, I took on a quieter role mentoring. I began speaking at community planning forums. Sometimes it was just 10 people in a basement rec room. Sometimes it was a full city council meeting. My message was always the same. Listen to the land and listen to the people who love it. The city even invited me to consult on a new safety initiative aimed at preventing unpermitted slope development. They wanted to name it after me. I declined that too, but I did help them write the opening line of the program brochure. One warning heeded can prevent a tragedy. One voice ignored can bury a neighborhood. Some days, I'd visit the memorial garden behind the retaining wall. It wasn't big, just a few benches, a curved path, and a ring of native shrubs that would root deep and hold fast. But it mattered. It stood as proof that something beautiful could still grow from disaster. One day, as Ellie and I sat there in the late afternoon sun, she turned to me and asked, "Do you ever miss the old house?" I smiled. "Every day." "Do you regret fighting them?" I shook my head. "Never." She leaned against my shoulder. "I think you saved more than just our lives." I looked out at the wall, at the slope beyond, no longer threatening, just landscape again. "No," I said. "We did." We sat in silence for a while, just listening. The air was still. No helicopters, no sirens, no groaning earth, just birdsong and wind in the trees. And somewhere in that silence, I realized something. We hadn't just rebuilt a house. We'd reclaimed our dignity, our agency, our voice. They had tried to silence us with fines, with letters, with legal threats. They tried to bury us under politics and policy. And when that didn't work, they tried to let the land finish the job. But the land didn't bury us. It exposed them. It tore away the facade, and what it left behind was ugly, yes, but also honest. And honesty is a foundation you can build on. Before we left, I stood and placed my hand on the plaque one last time. The metal was warm from the sun. While this ground gave way so others could stand stronger. I whispered the next part under my breath. So stand we will. And with that, Ellie and I walked back toward the truck, the evening light behind us, the wall before us, and the road ahead finally clear.